Hi, everyone, and welcome to AP Environmental Science, the lecture covering studying the Earth systems. We have two objectives today. Both of them are going to incorporate the human dependency on Earth's air, water, soil, just to exist. In the process, we've altered the planet, large or small, better for worse. And by studying environmental science, we can better understand how humans have changed the planet and look at ways of responding to these changes. So let's get started. Okay, before we begin, I just want to have you observe your surroundings. Just consider the air you breathe, the heating or cooling system that's keeping you comfortable right now, and maybe the natural and artificial light that helps you see. So the sum of all those conditions is essentially our environment. And you can take any place, your bedroom, for example, or your campus, or the world as a whole. So what environmental science is actually studying is humans' interaction with this system and the ones found in nature. And when we talk about systems, we're talking about any of these components that interact with each other, that when one changes, the other's affected. Perfect example could be the water cycle, where increased air temperatures result in increased evaporation, which then increase precipitation and so on. So that's a system of a set of interacting parts. And what environmental studies is encompassing is all of the effects, not just naturally in the world in regards to the earth science or the chemistry and meteorology, but humans as well. How economics come in play, consumption, ethics, how certain people in certain areas are treated, and even into the legal field as well. It's important to note that environmental science not to be confused with an environmentalist. An environmentalist is someone who participates in environmentalism. Perfect example is Jane Goodall promoting the population after studying the chimpanzee. And so do not confuse this with the actual environmental scientist. What an environmental scientist is doing is an actual person who is going through, like any scientist, the process of observation, hypothesis testing, and then field and laboratory search. And we'll look at that as we move on through the chapter. So an ecosystem, all an ecosystem is an area where there's interacting biotic and abiotic parts. And when we say biotic, just think of your biology class, bio meaning life. So that's all the living organisms, that being in this situation, the Mojave Desert, the coyote, the kitty fox, and even the plants as well, the Joshua tree. Whereas the biotic would be more like the air, the precipitation, all the non-living things. Prefix A meaning without, so without life. And we're going to look at how humans are altering natural systems. Perfect example is you have an old forest, dies from insect damage. These trees dry out, they catch fire, they ignite, you have a forest fire. And as disastrous as it seems, this forest fire causes a new forest to germinate. So we're going to look at how this natural process in regards to how the earth and all its biotic and abiotic components interact to make things work. We're going to look at how we kind of goof this up, how we kind of threw a stick in the spoke of these natural systems. And it's really, really important that we remember that we are a part of this environment. We can't just remove ourselves from the weather. We cannot remove ourselves from climate change. We cannot remove ourselves from certain living organisms we come in contact with. So realizing that we are being more in tune with our environment will help us in the long run. So a couple other ways we alter our systems. Development, especially in subdivisions, in agriculture, growing our land, changing the chemistry of air, water, and soil. That's mostly through pollution. CO2 in our atmosphere, pollutants in the water, and chemicals in the air. And for the past while, we have been more of a regional culture. It's since that scale of once agriculture took off is when our population started to boom. So another thing in environmental science are looking at science for stress. imagine it as when you go to the doctor. When you go to the doctor and they give you a physical, they check your heart rate, they check your temperature, they check your vitals, and what they're looking for is there any stress? And what environmental scientists will do is they'll do the exact same thing. They'll look at a certain area, they'll see if there's any indicators, which we'll discuss here in a moment, and then move on to the sustainability on how to protect the area. Looking more closely at the ecosystem services, essentially what we're saying here is that through those abiotic and biotic systems, the earth is producing certain resources that humans need, and that's essential for them to survive. Perfect example is food. Depending on how the soil is, the conditions in which to grow food and quantity of food that's fit for human consumption, even raw materials in regards to building shelter, fresh water, not just for drinking, but for cleaning, and think of your daily needs in regards to using water, and then finally medicinal resources as well. All of these, which we'll look much more closely at moving on. The best way I can think about it is almost taking care of your table as if you were a waiter. The better service you provide, the better tip you'll get. And I feel like that's a great way to look at it in regards to, the better way we take care of these resources, the better the payoff will be in the end in regards to the Earth's resources and what we can use to sustain ourselves. So there's these environmental indicators, and what these are is they're just, as we mentioned earlier, going to the doctor, they take your temperature, they'll take your blood pressure, take your measurements, and all they're doing is looking if there's any indicators, take blood to see if anything's going on and the reason for your sickness. So environmental scientists can do the same thing, and they look at 5 different things, which we'll look at closely here in a second. But these environmental indicators, for example, that they're looking at today is the amount of diversity in a certain area. Are there extinctions? Is extinction rising? And that's actually the trend right now, which from there we can develop an outlook, and then the impact, is it positive or negative? So you can see all these indicators that are currently being evaluated and measured, and what's the result going to be for us in the future. So essentially the goal of the environmental science is sustainability, and it's allowing us to live in our certain comforts that we have today, our creature comforts, but in the same time, not wasting resources for future generations. And the Iroquois had this 7th generation rule, and what they said is that the decisions that we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 years into the future. So ensuring that the success of the future generations that you may or may not know, that they at least have the same quality of life you have today. So that's the goal of earth science or environmental science. There's 3 ways we look at biological diversity. First is genetic diversity, species diversity, and then ecosystem diversity. We're going to look at each one closely here. When we talk about genetic diversity, what we're looking at, the higher genetic diversity, the better able a certain organism would be able to respond to a change in the environment, rather than a lower population or lower genetic diversity. So for example, if you have this species of fish that possess a high genetic diversity for disease resistance compared to another population of fish that do not have the immune system to fight off a certain disease, the fish with that genetic diversity, increased genetic diversity, will survive and be able to pass on its genes. Moving on to species diversity, right now, scientists have identified and cataloged about 2 million species on Earth. There's a guess where it's between 5 and 100 million, and with the most common estimate right now, we think there's 10 million different species on Earth. That's plants, animals, you name it, anything that's alive. So in regards to species diversity, it's the number of species in a region or in a habitat. And the more productive and resilient a species is, the better it's going to be able to recover from disturbance. So we notice this in areas where there's high species diversity, like a tropical rainforest where you have many different types of plant species growing in the forest, in the understory, and in the canopy, and it's more likely to be more productive than an ecosystem where there's maybe only a few crop species growing, limiting the amount of diversity. And we see this a lot in frog populations. Frogs are a tremendous indicator species of an environment because they live both in the water and need to breathe air. So environmental scientists will look at these organisms again because they're inhaling the air and because they absorb the environment through their skin. And unfortunately, what we're noticing now is frog populations are going down, which again, as an indicator species, imagine going to the doctor and there's certain vitals that aren't working correctly. That's usually a sign that something's not good. So as we move on to speciation, what we're doing is essentially the rate there's new species. And remember back from your biology class that evolution is a very slow process. So there's possibly 1 to 3 new species per year worldwide. And that has to be the topic of background extinction needs to get brought up. And because that is a very slow process as well. So background extinction rate is usually we have 1 species go to extinct every million years or so. But due to the human intervention or human interaction with the earth, we're starting to lose a lot more species per day. So if we look back to the 1500s, and depending on the species, be it mammals, birds, and so on, you can see the increase in the speciation and background extinction rates. And this is interesting as well. The correlation just between human population increase since the early 1800s and then extinctions of organisms. So again, looking at that indicator, the influence we have, good or bad, on the environment, it's usually not a good thing when certain species become extinct. Moving on to ecosystem diversity, what we're doing here is we're measuring the diversity of the systems or the number of habitats that exist in a region. Might be quite obvious to note that the more number of healthy and productive ecosystems usually means a healthier environment overall. But unfortunately, what's happening now is biodiversity is decreasing, looking like natural systems are putting another strain, and it looks like they've never seen it before in the past. So this decrease in biodiversity is indicating a negative for the human population. Food production can also be an indicator of the future generations in regards to how civilization can feed themselves. More than half the calories and proteins humans consume on Earth come from grains, and the problem is that the growth of the human population is putting a strain on this distribution to get adequate amounts. We do have the technology to increase yields of these grains, but it's not just keeping up with that population growth. So it's just something that in the future, do we take up space in regards to shelter, or do we set aside more land to feed the world's population? So in regards to our global surface temperature, our global surface temperature is dependent on CO2 concentrations, and not just CO2, it's the greenhouse gases. So methane and water vapor as well. And it's essential to note that for about 3.5 billion years, life has been the temperature has been pretty consistent. And when I mean consistent, I mean that it's allowed for liquid water to exist on the surface in one way, shape, or form. And again, we've had water. I said liquid water, but also we've had it in the form of vapor and in the form of ice. And nowadays, when we're looking for life on those exoplanets, we know that it's water has a very, very important role. So for 3.5 billion years, Earth has had that water. And that water vapor, what it's allowed us to do is keep a constant temperature. So those gases allow water to remain liquid or in the gaseous state and not just freeze. If we didn't have these gases that act like this blanket, re-emitting radiation that's bouncing back from light surfaces such as the ice sheets, these greenhouse gases are allowing that liquid water to exist. So the greenhouse effect is a good thing. It's what we need. It's the only reason we're here. But you see a lot now is that now what's happening is they're saying that the CO2 concentrations are now anthropogenic. And when we say anthro, think of an anthropologist. Anthropologist studies ancient humans. So these causes in regards to global temperatures increasing, which we'll see a graph here later on, are being induced by humans. And it is essential to note this isn't a new topic. In 1895, 1908, it was a process, but Svante Arrhenius, he came up with this model. He was studying ice ages. And he noticed whenever there was an ice age, CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere dropped. So he figured and it correlated that, and decrease in CO2 causes for a decrease in temperature, then vice versa should happen. And what we've noticed since the late 1800s, since the Industrial Revolution, that we have two y-axes here. Right-hand side is the global temperature in degrees C. Then we have our CO2 in parts per million. And since the Industrial Revolution, it's just skyrocketed in regards to global temperature. And never before have we ever seen in Earth's past CO2 above 400 parts per million. And sure enough, here we are today. Looking at the human population growth, which does have effect on CO2 concentrations, what we are seeing now is a increase in about over 1 million people every 5 days. And since the 60s, the world population has been slowly increasing, and they predict it will for about the next 50 to 100 years. And scientists are even projecting that the human population will be somewhere between 8.1 and 9.6 billion. And then in 2050, we'll stabilize between 7.1 to 10.5 billion by 2100. So we do have what we call, and we'll get more into this in this class, is carrying capacity. And even humans have a carrying capacity, and it looks like we're pushing that limit. And we can even move in on the world population clock and doing the math in regards to the amount of deaths and births per year. You can see at this current date, we are at about 7.4 billion people, with China being the most populous country. United States is a third. And we can take those numbers and just break them apart. And again, population and population density is what we'll look at as we move on through this year. So with increased human population, will also going to result in resource depletion. So in regards to arable land, that's just land where we can grow crops and food for us to eat, whereas forest and timber allows for development as well. And then seafood, even we're affecting the oceans. And as we go further and further, our population increases more and more, there's more of a demand for energy, which results in an increased demand for minerals that need to be mined. So our well-being, thinking back to that seventh nation, that Iroquois, where the actions you do today should positively affect seven generations into the future. So what we're looking at here is that living on Earth in a way that allows us to use its resources without depriving those future generations with the resources. And many scientists today even believe that achieving the sustainability is the single most important goal for human species. You always hear about saving the Earth, but it's, as you know, that the Earth has been through 5 extinctions already in regards to life, and the Earth is still here. It's life that disappears. So while we're saving the Earth, maybe we are saving ourselves in the long run. And the perfect example is the Easter Island in the South Pacific, where Native Islanders abused its resources, overcut its forests, cut down the trees, which resulted in a loss of the productivity of the soil, and in a very short while just gave hold to an island that couldn't support life. It's also important to note that it didn't help that Europeans brought disease, but a perfect example of the tragedy of the commons and the Mayan civilization as well, with their also being incorporated climate change. So when we define our human needs, what we're looking at is what it means to survive. And I understand in regards to a developed country and an undeveloped country, needs, or maybe the definition is used loosely. I mean, maybe a power outage at our house, or you lose Wi-Fi, or turning on the TV or even the air conditioning. When those are disconnected, it makes us very uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, I think we'll survive. So when we're defining human needs, we're looking at the essentials that people in developed or undeveloped country need in order just to survive. And that involves air, water, food, and shelter. So those electricity and internet are just the additional needs. It is important to note that developing nations have a higher population than people living in developed nations. But as you can see from the pie charts here, that even though developed nations have lower populations, our consumption of most resources, 3 out of 4 here, are people in developed nations. And lastly, we have biologist Edward O. Wilson's quote that the connection that humans subconsciously seek the rest of life. And that's what biophilia is, this need to make a connection to the rest of the world. And we're finding out more and more that connections with nature, even at a young age, promote learning, and even things like mental disorders and depression, that just being outside really does change a person's demeanor and has psychological effects. So we're going to finish up part 1 looking at our ecological footprint, and what we're looking here is just a calculation of looking at what a person consumes expressed in an area of land, and how much land is required to support that person's lifestyle. And a lot of things are taken in for granted. We look at how much energy, resources, water and food, even type of water you'll see, the transportation, waste disposal, and then diet. And in regards to diet, just think of a vegetarian, a person who only eats grains or plants. We look at the amount of land needed to provide that person with the food simply by the land that was needed to grow those plants. Whereas a person who eats meat, be it beef, chicken, we have to look at the amount of land required to feed the animal itself, the livestock, that is ultimately that's going to become the meat. So it shouldn't be no surprise that a person with a more meat-based diet is going to have a larger impact on the earth. And we'll look at these things much more closely as we move throughout the year. So lastly, going back to that developed and undeveloped, you can see here most of the developed countries with their higher socioeconomic have a larger impact than even those countries with more people, yet less impact. So that concludes part 1. Most resources are on the website. Check that out when you get a chance.